Welcome to my YouTube channel. Alright, we're going to deconstruct a really important scenario today. A full-blown trade crisis erupts between the US and India. Let's break it down. So in the summer of 2025 things got tense, really tense. The US-India relationship pretty much hit a breaking point. In fact, one analyst, Michael Kugelman, went so far as to call it the worst crisis in 2 decades. That's a huge statement. So how on earth did we get here? That's what we're going to unpack. We'll look at the causes, the real-world economic damage, the really crucial strategic lessons this whole thing holds for India's future on the world stage. And when I say it escalated, I mean it happened fast. Look at this timeline. August 1st, the US slaps a 25% tariff on Indian goods. Just 3 days later, India's Ministry of External Affairs fires back, calling them unjustified and unreasonable. But then less than a month later, Washington doubles down. They jack up the tariff to a staggering 50%. This was a massive blow, and it forced New Delhi's hand. By early September, they were already scrambling, cutting GST on hundreds of items just to cushion the shock at home. So a 50% tariff, that's a huge move. You have to ask, what could possibly trigger such an aggressive action, especially against a country that's supposed to be a strategic partner? Well, as we're about to see, the official reason that was really just the tip of the iceberg. 50%, just let that number sink in. This wasn't just some minor trade adjustment. This was a massive economic weapon. We're talking about one of the highest tariffs the Trump administration had imposed on anybody, and it put a huge chunk of India's exports to its single biggest market at risk, a real shock to the system. And this is where you can really see why India felt it was being singled out. I mean, just look at this comparison. India gets hit with a 50% tariff. India currently faces a 50% tariff rate on most goods imported into the United States, effective from 27 August 2025. This is part of a broader set of tariffs imposed by the US on various countries. While the current average tariff rate on imports from China is approximately 130%, which includes a new 100% tariff announced by President Trump on top of the existing 30% duties. These tariffs are set to take effect on 1st November 2025. And the current tariff rate on goods from the European Union is 10%, with specific rates of 15% for certain sectors like autos and pharmaceuticals, as part of the recent trade agreements and tariffs implemented by the US government. It just doesn't add up, right? Especially when you consider that the US trade deficit with those other partners was much, much larger. It really makes you think something else has to be going on here. So that really begs the question. And for any good analysis, this is what you have to ask. Was this whole thing really about trade, or were there much deeper geopolitical games being played? Okay, so the official reason the US gave it was India's oil imports from Russia. That was the public story. But when you dig a little deeper, you find it's way more complicated. Analysts point to a whole cocktail of reasons. You've got friction over India's policy of strategic autonomy and its role in BRICS. There were even reports about personal politics, specifically President Trump being unhappy that India rejected his offer to mediate with Pakistan. And all of this is wrapped up in that broader America First ideology, a kind of protectionism that has deep roots in American history. All right? We're talking bilateral groupings and agreements involving India, right? This whole crisis is a prime example of how international politics can directly affect India's interests. Okay, so we've talked about the why. Now let's get into the so what. What was the actual tangible impact of this tariff on India? Let's look at the economic shock waves. The effect was immediate and honestly, brutal. Look at this chart. In just 3 months from May to August, exports to the US just plummeted. We're talking a 22.2% drop, and that was just the beginning. The scary part was that everyone knew the next numbers were probably going to be even worse. And it's so important to remember that these aren't just abstract numbers on a chart. This is about real people, real jobs, a 44% drop in shrimp exports. That's a direct blow to fishing and processing communities all along the coast. The hit to textiles to the diamond cutters in Surat. We're talking about millions of livelihoods suddenly at risk. But here's where things get really interesting and kind of worrying. The tariffs were obviously the big problem, But the economic damage started spreading to exports that weren't even being taxed. Why would that happen? That was the real puzzle. Why were tariff-free goods, like smartphones, also collapsing? I mean, look at this, a 58% drop in smartphone exports to the US. 58%, and remember, these phones were exempt from the tariffs. This was the number that really set off alarm bells. It suggested something much bigger was happening. It wasn't just about tariffs anymore. It was about a total loss of business confidence, a chilling effect that made you wonder if the entire foundation of the economic partnership was starting to crack. So the economic fallout was huge, but the crisis went way beyond just dollars and cents. It created some major friction on the geopolitical chessboard, really testing the core of the US-India strategic partnership. And at the heart of that friction was this idea right here, strategic autonomy. It's a cornerstone of Indian foreign policy. And what it means, really, is that India reserves the right to make decisions based on its own national interests without being pushed around or forced to pick a side by other major powers. It's about being able to chart your own course. And what's really telling is that it wasn't just India that was concerned. A lot of very prominent voices back in the US were sounding the alarm, and this wasn't a partisan thing. You had people from across the political spectrum like Fareed Zakaria and Nikki Haley basically saying the same thing, that this was a huge strategic mistake. You don't alienate the one country that can act as a counterbalance to China and Asia. You'd be undoing 25 years of hard work, and you can imagine the ripple effects. This kind of move throws a wrench into key alliances like the Quad. As former National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan pointed out, it's a huge strategic harm. It makes other countries question our commitments. How can you have a strong alliance if you're worried your main partner might just pull the rug out from under you at any moment? It undermines global confidence. So okay, India's at a crossroads. It's facing this huge economic and diplomatic pressure. The big question is, how did New Delhi respond, and what are the key takeaways for the future? Well, India's response was firm, very firm. The External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar basically drew a line in the sand. He said, and I'm paraphrasing here, India's red lines have to be respected. The message was clear, we're willing to talk, but our core national interests are not up for debate. So what does that look like in practice? Well, experts laid out a really smart multi-pronged response. First, you engage in smart negotiations. Don't just get into a shouting match. Find areas of mutual interest where you can make a deal. Second, you have to provide targeted relief at home to protect the sectors that are getting hit the hardest. Third, and this is so crucial, you have to diversify your markets. You can't be this dependent on any one country. That means fast-tracking trade deals with places like the EU and the UK. And finally, and maybe most importantly, you use a crisis like this as a catalyst, a reason to push through the deep domestic reforms that will make the entire economy stronger for the long haul. And you know, in every crisis, there's often an opportunity. This whole ordeal actually accelerated something that was already happening, the global China Plus One strategy, with companies getting nervous about putting all their eggs in one basket. This was a golden opportunity for India to step up and say, hey, we're a reliable, stable alternative for your global supply chains. Which leaves us with one final, massive question to chew on. Was this whole thing just a temporary squabble over trade, or were we witnessing the early stages of a fundamental realignment of global power? The answer to that question is something that's going to define international relations for decades to come. Thanks for joining this. Please subscribe and leave your comments so that I can provide more interesting videos for you.